When the Netflix series Wednesday released on the platform, it logged a very impressive 341 million watch hours in its very first week of release. What I find so impressive about that statistic isn't just the number. I mean, yeah, that's a lot of watch hours. But the fact that they all happened within the first week after the series came out. That only happens when you get a lot of word of mouth going all at once, which means a lot of people not only watched the series, but found it compelling enough and exciting enough to want to tell their friends and family and share it around. I know that's definitely what I did. I started watching the show at like 9 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden it was 2, 3 in the morning, and I only had a couple episodes left to go, and I decided to throw caution to the wind, and I stayed up till 5 o'clock finishing the story. And you know what? I regret nothing, because it was excellent. There were so many things about it that I loved, and especially there were so many things about the storytelling that I thought were not only incredibly well done, but that serve as an excellent lesson for us writers to improve our own craft as we work to tell equally compelling stories. So in this video, we're going to take a deep dive look at the story of Wednesday and talk about what made it so compelling and successful in the first place, but we're also going to take a look at a couple of things that, in my opinion, almost ruined the series. But, why? Why would you do that if you don't have to? Yeah, there's definitely some stuff that could have been fixed, but the end result was still an incredible story, an incredible show, and we are going to talk all about it. So before we get too far into it, I feel it is highly necessary to bring you today's spoiler warning. Yeah, all the spoilers. We're going to talk about all the details of the story. You can't do a story review in depth without getting into what happens in the story. So I'm going to assume that you have either seen the series and you're excited to talk about it with me, or that you just really don't care about spoilers in the first place. And speaking of that, I want to clarify that in this video, we are going to be talking about the story of Wednesday. I'm not going to get into reviewing or critiquing all of the other elements of filming a show or a movie, because that's not really my area of expertise. I did think the acting was phenomenal. Jenna Ortega was brilliant. Gwendolyn Christie is a goddess. You know, the music was wonderful. I thought for what I know of it, the cinematography was great, but that's not my area of expertise. So we're going to talk about the writing and the storytelling and the narrative structure of the show, because that's really what this channel is all about. So the three fundamental aspects of any story are person, place, and premise, and we're going to talk about the show in that order, starting with person, and what better person to start with than Wednesday herself.
Wednesday is certainly a unique name.
You know, when a series title is the name of a character, that character is going to be pretty important. And yeah, this whole show, the whole story, hinges on and succeeds because of how great of a character Wednesday herself is. The writers do an excellent job of introducing us to her compelling aspects right away. She's intelligent, she's proactive, she figures out exactly what she wants and she goes after it immediately. Those are all really fun and interesting attributes in a character, and it's a really good example of the fact that very often great characters wouldn't necessarily make like your great friend that you or neighbor that you would just want to be around all the time. I'm not sure that Wednesday would be like, yes, let's please go get coffee or have a slumber party, because she's a bit intense, and that is what makes her such a great character in the first place. Wednesday is also a great example of how to write what I would just call like an unlikable protagonist or a difficult protagonist. This is something you see attempted fairly often when you're trying to write like an anti-hero or variations of protagonists that start out with or maintain some pretty rough edges along the way. How do you do that without turning off the audience or the readers from liking or connecting with or empathizing with that character, especially when the character is a pretty extreme character that is outside of the normal bounds of our experience, so it's harder to sort of relate to them? Well, one of the ways they do that is by creating a contrast between the things that Wednesday says and the things that Wednesday does. And that is a technique that you can apply to your own writing of your own characters. Wednesday is not shy about saying what she thinks about the world or herself or other people.
For the record, I don't believe I'm better than everyone else. Just that I'm better than you.
She has a very high opinion of herself and generally a pretty poor opinion of everyone else. She doesn't care if other people like her. In fact, she says she would prefer if people don't like her, so they would just leave her alone, and she often will say some pretty intense things that maybe are true, but are the kind of thing you don't always say to other people because it can be hurtful or whatever.
Oh, you should really get on Insta, Snapchat, and TikTok.
I find social media to be a soul-sucking void of meaningless affirmation.
She's fine with being hurtful. So on the one hand, she has all these things that she says. She wants to be alone. She doesn't like other people. She all these things, right? But she then does things that often contrast with what she says. Even though she says she doesn't want other people around, she will still go out of her way to be around them. We see this in her relationship with Eugene as she kind of joins the Hummers Club. She's pretty dismissive of him, and yet she clearly takes a liking to him. And it's always a little bit even unclear to us as the viewers whether she's even fully aware of how big of a contrast there is between the way she talks to and about Eugene and the way she actually treats him.
Blab and I will squeeze you like a honeycomb.
Snitchers get stung. It's hive code.
That kind of contrast is interesting. It's compelling. We tune into it more because it implies the necessity for character growth. It implies an opportunity for change. And then we're looking at that going, oh wow, this is, wait, what's going to happen here? Is she going to grow? Is she going to change? Is she going to learn? Is she going to be different? How is that going to happen? She says these things, but then she does these other things. And that's an interesting tension. And it makes her more relatable and easier to empathize with. One of the biggest places that this happens in the story overall happens in the second episode, because I think the writers knew that they needed to humanize Wednesday just a little bit and sort of complicate her a little bit so that we didn't run the risk of having the viewer start to dislike her or be a little turned off by her. In the second episode, after she's just gotten to know her roommate Enid, and their relationship is clearly established as one of the significant relationships of the story, the whole subplot of the Po Cup, which is the boat race that the school puts on, that Wednesday ends up participating in, is a perfect example of how they played this out. She says very clearly, this is stupid, I'm not interested, I'm not going to do it.
The social part, not so much. Besides, it'll cut into my writing time.
And yet, when Enid needs her help, yeah, she kind of gives a justification for like, well, I'm going to do it because I really just want to stick it to this other character I don't like.
I want to humiliate Bianca so badly that the bitter taste of defeat burns in her throat.
Yeah, but mostly you're doing it because we're friends, right?
But she does it. She joins Enid's team and actually helps them win the Po Cup, which she didn't need to do. If she really meant what she said, she could have just been like, yeah, screw you, you're on your own, I don't care. But she does kind of care, even though she doesn't want to fully admit it to herself or to anybody else. And again, that kind of contrast and conflict is really interesting and is a great way to develop a difficult or an unlikable protagonist. You can have them say really extreme things, but then balance it out with what they do and some of the contrast that creates. Another thing that I think is really worth talking about here is what a great job the writers did of foregrounding Wednesday's character flaws and her arc of character growth and tying it directly into the central theme of the story. I would argue that the theme of the story of Wednesday is no man is an island. The idea that you can't let your desire for greatness or achievement rob you of great relationships and make you miss the people who are in your life. And that is the sort of repeated challenge or struggle. Wednesday begins on one pole of that issue. Like, she is very clear that she states the counter theme. She says, no, people are stupid. They slow you down. They will let you down. They're a waste of time. You're vulnerable if you open up and trust others. She starts out saying the opposite of the theme, which again is a really effective storytelling technique. When you know your theme, have your protagonist have a lot of room to grow and make their inherent character flaws one of the biggest obstacles to the successful resolution of the story and the theme in the climax of the story. The writers do that extremely well here in this story, and we as readers feel it and sense it, even if it's subconsciously, and the sense of the tension between where she is now and where she's going to need to be or who she's going to need to be for the story to be resolved successfully, we sense that tension and sort of the gap that still exists between those two poles, and we are then become more and more and more invested in wanting to watch what happens, wanting to watch if and how she will grow or change her perspective on that issue, and maybe eventually arrive at the positive side of the theme, which in fact she does. So that's actually a great segue to talk about the rest of the cast, including the antagonist and the secondary characters. And let's tackle the antagonist first. One of the things that this show does so well, that is one of the big challenges of the mystery genre in general, is how do you have a compelling antagonist when, by definition, you need to hide their identity until the big reveal at the end, when the detective has solved the mystery and shows the audience who the antagonist was in the first place. Well, there's two major ways to do that, and they use both techniques extremely effectively. The first way is that you create multiple minor antagonist characters who are not the ultimate antagonist or villain of the story as a whole, but serve to provide that sort of conflict and tension against the protagonist in smaller moments. Principal Weems is one of the predominant antagonists that Wednesday butts heads with repeatedly throughout the story.
That was a disaster. The mayor is furious.
But Enid also serves as an antagonist at points a little bit later to the story. When she gets really angry at Wednesday for the way that she's been treating her, she now serves that antagonistic role.
I've tried really, really, really hard to be your friend.
I never asked you to do that.
You didn't have to, because that's what friends do.
Her mother, the psychiatrist, the sheriff, these are all smaller antagonists that provide opportunities for conflict and opposition within scenes and within the larger arc of the story that sort of hold that place while we have this looming, mysterious, ultimate bad guy doing stuff in the background. Without the minor antagonists present within those scenes, you lose a lot of narrative tension and narrative energy, but they made sure to do that. They made sure to give different characters at different times that sort of antagonistic role within a scene or within the story as a whole. The other way you work at this, though, is to make sure that your ultimate antagonist is still present and active in the story, even if you're not revealing their identity. So at various points along the way, right about the time when we kind of forgot, like, oh right, there's a monster running around killing everybody and we don't know why or who it is or what's going on. That's the ultimate mystery that is trying to be solved in the mystery subplot of this show. Right about the time you forget that, they reintroduce it by having the antagonist do something. So the monster kills a new person, or a mysterious figure goes and blows up the cave just when they started to get a break by finding the cave in the first place. When Wednesday finds the hidden laboratory with the body parts in the basement of the abandoned spooky mansion, when she finally goes back, it's been emptied out because, the cunning antagonist went back and was one step ahead of her.
No, it's all gone now.
Somebody cleared this place out after we left.
So having that happen repeatedly throughout the story continues to build that sense that, yes, don't forget, there's a bad guy here, there's an antagonist here. Right now, the antagonist is more powerful than Wednesday because they know what their plan is and they're putting it into action, and they're often one step ahead of her, and they're making her course of action more difficult. You can do that without actually revealing the identity of your villain or your antagonist or whatever the nature of that role is. This is especially true in the detective genre or the thriller genre, but it's something that can apply in a lot of spaces, so I think it's worth paying attention to how well the writers did that. And finally, just talking about the rest of the cast as a whole, I thought they were broadly fine. Some were much better than others. I thought Enid was a great character, not just because of how she was written, but because of the function that she served in the story. What I thought, again, the writers did an incredible job of making sure that, for the most part, the other secondary characters in the story weren't just there, but they were there to serve a function of either contrast or conflict with Wednesday. Enid was a great character, not just because she's fun and her personality is well-defined and her responses are well-defined, but because she presents such a clear contrast with Wednesday, which helps you understand the protagonist better and forces the protagonist to grapple with themselves and their preferences and their opinions and their perspective on life and their responses to things, because they're having to relate to this character who is so different and who represents a different take on the theme.
I still think you're weird as shit, though.
The feeling is incredibly mutual.
Enid's take on the theme is, everybody, love everyone all the time, all the people, and she is actually vulnerable to being overly tuned into what people think of her, and that's part of how she needs to grow. Again, in relation to the theme, the nature of relationships and how important they are. She represents a different perspective on that theme as a character, which makes her arc more interesting, and it makes Wednesday's arc more interesting. Principal Weems, same thing. She's a great character, partly because she presents such a strong contrast to Wednesday, both in her personality and behavior, but again, also in her relation to the theme. Her whole thing is, I will do whatever it takes to protect this school and this community, and I care about this community of kids and Nevermore as an institution, and I will break maybe my moral code, maybe I'll do things that seem underhanded or problematic, all in service of this larger vision. And yeah, a lot of the secondary characters were more forgettable, but again, I think that's okay. Like, you need to know who within your cast is going to get your page time, because you only have so much to go around, and it's fun and can be really good to have a large cast of characters, especially if the context requires it. Like, we're in a school, there's got to be a lot of kids. They can't all get adequate screen time or page time, because then we would lose the focus of the story and it would take way too long to tell. So it's okay to decide, like, this is just, the kid, he's the Medusa kid, his snakes turn people to stone. We don't know much about him. He doesn't get super well developed, but that's fine because he serves a function of filling out the cast. The two characters I thought were not written as well as they could have been were both of the two male love interests. Will and Xavier, both, I don't know, they were fine. They were kind of boring, to be perfectly honest. I don't know how you make a kid who, like a brooding artist who has the ability to make his paintings come to life, boring, but they kind of did. It felt a little bit like they were characters who were pulled from a different story, like they got pulled out of a CW story or a Twilight fanfic. I don't know. They weren't my favorite. They were fine. They weren't the worst. I feel like they could have been better. Will, in particular, I was not loving his character because he was just very, muted and subdued, and it seemed weird that he was such, a vanilla guy, but they were clearly setting it up that, he was the one that Wednesday was attracted to, but, from everything we know about her as a character, why does she like this super vanilla guy? I don't feel like they did a great job of validating that. But then with the reveal at the end that he's actually the Hyde, he's the monster, and his turn, the last little bits of him when he went full psycho, that he was great then, and the actor did a phenomenal job then, and I get that you can't bring that in sooner. And it made sense why they were trying to kind of keep his character a little bit more vanilla and mellow so that twist didn't get spoiled. But yeah, both of the two male love interests were a little bit weak, could have been maybe a little bit better, but it is what it is. So let's move on from talking about the persons of the story by talking about the place, Nevermore, as a setting. I thought the setting of Nevermore was, again, fine. It was interesting, but not very thoroughly explored. One of the things I kept thinking as I was watching the show is, wait a minute, we're in a school for supernatural outcast kids, which means they have parents who are living out there in the, there's all these really interesting questions that are immediately raised by the existence of this school in the first place. And then in the episode where the parents come to visit, that's even more foregrounded, because here are all of these, wait a minute, these this werewolves and vampires and all these people who are out there in the world. The little subplot with Bianca, one of the siren character who Wednesday butts heads with a lot when her mom comes back, that again, they drop these little hints of this wider world. And I get, that's not the focus of this story. You need to keep the story focused. I kind of wish there would have been a way for them to explore some of those interesting things a little bit more, because the generic, school for the supernatural, that has been done enough, and I don't feel like they put much of a spin on that idea. I feel like that is one way where they could have gone heavier into the tone of the Addams Family series in general. Nevermore, to me, felt more like a Twilight or a Harry Potter, or it felt close, more akin to existing YA tropes and structures than something that maybe fit with the Addams Family leaning more into the gothic vibe. They were trying to do it, but they also kind of didn't. I don't know. It could have been better, I feel like, but it served its function well enough. And I thought the contrast of having the school as one primary setting and then the town, the normal world outside of the school as another primary setting, that was effective because it gave the opportunity to see Wednesday and the other characters in different environments and situations, which then lets you see them in different lights or gives you different kinds of moments and scenes. So I'm glad they included that, and they made the town a more defined location and setting for the story. So I thought that was good. But overall, I feel like the place part of it was, it was there. There's certainly a lot more they could explore if they decide to renew the series and they go further on. I hope they get a little bit more into developing the world that this story takes place in, because I think there's a lot of interesting potential there that wasn't really explored or realized in the series that we have seen so far. Which leads us to talking about the premise of the story, which I thought was a really interesting combination of the detective genre with a coming-of-age story arc. The detective or mystery element part, if that's all it had been, and the authors got confused and went a little too far into focusing on that aspect of the story, it wasn't the best. I mean, it's certainly not Agatha Christie. Like, I actually, in the second episode, I wrote down my guesses for who's the secret antagonist, who's the monster, and I was right. Like, I figured it out, partly because one of the biggest challenges of the detective genre is that you end up very quickly distilling down the possible suspects and options, because here's your cast of characters, it's got to be one of these. And you also sort of know it's not going to be the most obvious ones, because that would be pretty boring. It's really hard to create a compelling and surprising twist, because very often, that's the one you least expect. Who would make the most sense within everything we know about Wednesday as a character and the type of story that's being told to be the surprising betrayal? Well, oh, maybe the guy she kind of really starting to like. Wouldn't that make the most sense as the biggest twist? He's the monster. I like how they separated the antagonist into two characters, where you have the monster, and early on in the story, you're not sure if that's it. And then they start kind of dropping more and more hints that there's more going on and there's more motive behind what's happening. Because from the perspective of the monster and then the actual villain, Christina Ricci's character, there are moments when the choices don't quite make sense and it's harder to unravel the motive, or harder, the clues point in two different directions. So that worked pretty well. But overall, it was a pretty standard mystery story beginning to end. But that was okay, because the other part of the story, as a coming-of-age character drama, Wednesday's own journey from frustrated, isolated, misunderstood, and unself-realized, unself-satisfied person to integrated into a community and more fully realized as a person, that was a really compelling. That was the money of the whole show. That's what made it work. And the fact that the writers knew that and they kept the focus heavily on that, the pace of that story arc was pretty much perfect. The tensions and the moments and the various ways where her own growth as a character in relation to the theme of the story, which was all, the tensions and the problems and the challenges of relationships, but why relationships ultimately are worth the price you have to pay for them and the ways you have to make yourself vulnerable and so on. That was excellent. And I think that is what really gave the series its drive. And that was the thing that captured our attention and invested us so heavily into watching the show and then sharing it and talking about it. Because if it had just been the detective part, I'm not sure it would have had the same oomph. So with all this praise that I have been heaping on the show, we are now ready to talk about the part that almost killed it for me, which is the ending. The climax of the whole story had a lot of problems, in my opinion, and there are various ways where it just dissipated so much of the energy and tension that they had been building up in a couple of ways that I think are really worth talking about. I think the biggest problem with the ending of the show is that the writers kind of weren't sure what type of story they wanted to tell at the end, primarily with the way that they employed the antagonist. So all the way along throughout the story, you have this building threat from the antagonist of this, the looming villain in the background that we don't have named yet. They're either the monster that's killing people, or they're it's some way related to the monster, and they have a plan, and stuff is happening, and it's building and building and building, and then you get the detective arc climax, which is Wednesday does the big thing of, aha, I've solved the mystery, here is your villain. And then shortly after that, when we, instead of following that to the conclusion, when you finally get, the shot of Christina Ricci's acting is so great in that scene where she's doing her I'm just a good and then it drops, the mask drops, and her persona totally changes, and her crazy psycho part comes out, and she kills the Principal Weems, boom. And then immediately after that, we go to a process where she fulfills her big plan by summoning the spirit of Joseph Crackstone, the guy who was in the past. He was not the antagonist of the story. He was a character in the past that sort of represented some stuff, and they tried to make him also bad, but it was very schizophrenic. And then all of a sudden now we have this, zombie guy who, okay, first off, when did he get magic powers? When he is resurrected, he's a wizard now, but the whole point of his character is that he hated the supernatural, so why is he suddenly magic? I don't get that at all. But also, on top of that, as soon as he appears, the actual antagonist that we have been focusing all of our energy towards, should be the conflict that we have the showdown building towards, she just gets kicked to the curb.
Be gone, or I will cut thy tongue from thy wretched mouth.
Never meet your heroes.
After that moment, she literally just walks out, and now we're supposed to care about this new antagonist who has had very little development in the story. There's very little payoff for that build-up, and they have a fight scene, which is a very different kind of ending. We don't get the catharsis of the ending of the detective line because it's immediately replaced with and now battle, we're going to fight it out because this is now an action story and he's trying to kill everyone, burn down the school. It's muddy in a way that the climax should not be muddy. The climax of the story should be the synthesis of everything that it has been building towards all the way along, where the thematic payoff happens and all the threads are sort of woven together and paid off in the best and most compelling way possible. And instead, we get a showdown between Wednesday and a character we don't care about because we haven't hardly seen them at all, instead of the antagonist that we've been working towards all the way along. And that's the case because when she finally beats him, we have to have a second final showdown because, oh wait, we also have this other antagonist character that we developed, so now you don't even get the catharsis of her winning. We have to do it all over again because that wasn't really the bad guy, that wasn't really the antagonist, so the fact that she beat him doesn't even matter. Now we have to do it again with a second big showdown with the antagonist. If they had just kept the focus on that character, it would have made the ending so much better. And yes, I understand that I'm splitting hairs. It wasn't the end of the world. I've asked some friends who watched it what they thought, and they didn't hate it, but I've also not heard anybody talking about the ending as a memorable part of the story at all. I have not heard a single person that I've asked say, oh man, what a great ending. It was all the other stuff along the way, and why not try harder to tell an incredible story that ends with an incredible climax and an incredible payoff that actually lingers with your readers and your watchers because it does its job, instead of kind of losing the thread and tripping at the finish line all of a sudden. Okay, Justin, I hear you saying, fine, fair enough. Those are some problems with the ending, but could you really have done it any differently? Yeah, I really think you could have. In fact, I honestly think it sort of writes itself. The story could be the same all the way up until the part where they have the showdown in the crypt and Wednesday gets stabbed and they use her blood to bring back the spirit of Crackstone. But instead of having him manifest as an actual character who now is the main character in the scene, why not just have his spirit, his essence, empower the actual villain and make the actual antagonist that we've been building towards even stronger and even more dangerous? Then instead of splitting our focus, we actually just up the stakes even further. Wednesday gets stabbed and Christina Ricci walks off to do her awful thing, but she's the actual focus and she goes to burn down Nevermore and do all that stuff. Wednesday gets healed, you have all the other stuff is fine, and then when you get to the final conflict, instead of having it be a conflict in two parts, we're still 100% focused on the final confrontation between our protagonist and our antagonist in the ultimate showdown. And the other thing that would have made the ending so much better is to really pay off the theme. They kind of tried to do that by having it be like, they bring in some of the side characters that they've been building towards, but it could have been done in a much more definitive way where you have this clear sense that initially Wednesday's trying to like fight her and defeat her on her own, and it doesn't go well, and it's ha ha ha, you've been defeated, like, you know, you're gonna die alone. And then it's like, wait, she's not alone, and you get like an Avengers Assemble moment where the other characters come in, and Wednesday's like has her cathartic realization where she completes the ultimate transformation that she's been building towards as a character by learning to rely on and trust other people. And then it's the power of friendship, or the power of the conclusion of the theme is the actual thing that unlocks the successful resolution of the story in the climax. And they have their big showdown, and then they can just beat the antagonist one time, not twice, and the release of that tension and the satisfaction that you would get from an ending like that would have been so much higher than the way that it was actually done, which is a bit of a bummer because the show itself was so great and the story itself was so great right up until that point, and then it lost a little bit of agency for me right at the end in some ways that I think could have been done better. So with all of that now said and out of the way, I rate my stories on a scale from did not finish to stay up as late as it takes to finish. And yeah, I already told you which one this is because that's exactly what I did. I stayed up way too late to finish it because I was hooked all the way along. The problems with the ending and some of the weaker characters notwithstanding, the central energy and pace of watching Wednesday as a character grapple with the core theme and the way that that was played out moment by moment throughout the story, I thought were excellent. I thought all of the different elements of it were incredibly well done, and I think it serves as a phenomenal example of how to tell a really compelling story that audiences will not only love, but will want to talk about and share, which is really, in my opinion, the ultimate mark of a successful story. So, Netflix's Wednesday, what did you think about it? I would love to know in the comments your favorite moments, your favorite characters. Do you agree with some of my assessments? Do you disagree with them? Do you think I'm being overly nitpicky about the ending? Let me know down below, and I will see you next time.